I grew up in a Jewish home, as most Jewish people do. My background is that in growing up, I would go to public school and also went to Hebrew school. In public school, you would go from, was it 8 o'clock in the morning until, 2, 3 in the afternoon, and then afterwards, all the Jewish kids, we would go off to Hebrew school. Do you know what happens when you take a child and you put him in school from 8 in the morning until 6 at night? You get MPD, multiple personality disorder. You shouldn't do that to a child. And so when I went off to Hebrew school, in my generation, it was very typical to do that. And it was really in preparation for our bar mitzvah. But it's a time when a Jewish boy does enter into, in a sense, into manhood within a Jewish community and can take up his place within the Jewish community. Is an example that a synagogue service can't begin until there's what's called a minyan. And that is, there has to be 10 men. And a boy, when he's been bar mitzvah, can be one of those men. And the question is that what's the purpose for? Did I even understand what the bar mitzvah was for? And honestly, no. I'm not even sure that most Jewish kids even understand what their bar mitzvah is all about. It's a huge deal in a Jewish home. Their son being bar mitzvah. Probably in a lot of Jewish homes, more is spent on that bar mitzvah than most of you spent on your daughter's wedding. It's a really big deal. I grew up in a blue-collar family, and so ours was more of a little deal. But it was something that my parents would have been proud of. And so I went through Hebrew school, and then after going for about 8 years, about a year past my bar mitzvah, I just didn't want to go anymore. In the beginning, I was just excited. I was excited about learning about my people, learning Hebrew, and it was exciting and new in the beginning. But frankly, you know what it's like, as you have shared Christ with people that have just gone through the ritual of religion and knowing that it brings no inner peace, no joy, no peace, nothing. It's empty. And so it's no different when I was going to Hebrew school, being involved, and preparing for my bar mitzvah, as I got to a point, it just had no meaning and purpose. And so, like many other Jewish children, I discontinued going to Hebrew school, shortly after my bar mitzvah. And so I was looking for something to give me some significance in my life. A 13-year-old looking for something that would give him some significance. And for me, what it ended up being is that I ran cross-country, indoor track and field. That became a focal point of my life. The first year was spectacular, as I came in last almost every time. And yet I persevered. I would run in the wintertime. Here, it's pretty easy to practice outside in the wintertime, but this was up north where there was snow. And so I would run whether the weather was hot, cold, whatever it was. I wanted to excel. And so over a period of time, I became the leading distance runner in our high school. I set records, and then somewhere around October of 1967, I broke Clark Walder's record. And that record still stands today. Now, but I need to actually tell you the rest of the story, because it's the rest of the story. And so when I broke that record, that was really significant for me. The problem was it was an inter-squad meet, which meant we raced against each other. It was unofficial, and it didn't count. And that was the last year that course was ever run. That's why that record still stands today. And there was something that was really important to me and significant. I grew up in a blue-collar home. I grew up with a family that we weren't demonstrative of love at all. I think I remember my father telling me that he loved me once. I think that was about it. We just weren't close. My parents would say, if they were alive, they would say they just didn't know how to be that kind of parent. They said there were no books written for it. And I think that's a pretty poor excuse, but that was the kind of home that I grew up in. It wasn't that my family didn't love me. It's just that we weren't a family that knew how to share affection, talk to each other. And so that's why I became a person looking for something that would give me some kind of significance in life. And so went off to Penn State, where I majored in architecture. And I'll never forget that my first year in school was a real challenging year. I wanted to be away from home so much, and yet it was so hard for me being away my first year at school. And I went out for cross country once again, but there was something that was missing, that zeal and excitement that once had carried me through all those years when I was in junior high and high school. It was just gone. And I didn't know why, I didn't know what was going on, and so I settled into complacency. During my freshman year in school, I think it was either my freshman or probably my sophomore year, there was on campus, there was a poster that was this old caricature of Jesus, and it was this black and white picture that said it was a wanted poster. You ever remember seeing those years and years and years ago? You wouldn't see them now because they would never be helpful today, the type of trying to advertise some type of event. But back then, that kind of thing was. And what I said when I saw Jesus, I want nothing to do with that. You have to understand that growing up in a Jewish home, I grew up my father fought in World War II, and Jewish people wanted nothing to do with the Gentiles. You see, our caricature is that we had no understanding of Christianity. Christianity through the decades, more than decades, just through the centuries, have persecuted Jewish people. You'd even take a look at the culmination of the genocide which took place in World War II, and Jewish people would say those were Christians who did that. Now, you and I know that how false that is, and yet even Martin Luther, who we have a lot to be grateful to him, was anti-Semitic. And so, as someone once said, is that Jewish history could be written in blood, or church history could be written in blood and punctuated in violence. And so, Jewish people would keep Gentiles at a distance from them because they have this caricature, because it was this distortion of Christianity. And I was no different, growing up in a home like that. And so, when I was on campus and saw that wanted poster, and so the response that you heard me say before, that I want nothing to do with him, you have to understand what that came out of. And so while I was at Penn State, as I said, it settled in complacency. And then during my sophomore year, there was a little poster. I'm not even sure if it was a poster or whatever. It was an advertisement for a meeting that was taking place in my dormitory. And it was called How to Be a Christian Without Being Religious. You have to understand, I wanted nothing to do with that. And yet, for some odd reason, for a study break of all things, I went down to this meeting. It makes no sense, if you're not a believer, why I would end up with that meeting, except we know it was the sovereignty of God that brought me there. I wanted nothing to do with Jesus. I didn't understand anything about Jesus. And yet, I went to this meeting. It made no sense that I was there. I can't even tell you what my thinking was while I went there. It's sort of the type of, you've heard people say, what were you thinking? I have no idea. And yet I was there. And the meeting was pretty simple. Someone shared their testimony, and someone shared a short message of the gospel of how to come to know Christ. I stood up at the end and was pretty arrogant and said that each person can get God in his own way. And so that began a journey of about the next 7 months, where I met off and on with one of the men on campus, and we began to go over Messianic prophecy. Now, you and I would get pretty excited looking at Messianic prophecy. You read Isaiah 53, which is affectionately known as the gospel in the Old Testament. And you take a look, Psalm 22 about the death and resurrection of Jesus, and the foretelling of it, and how exciting all of this is. But if you know nothing about Jesus, then those prophecies mean absolutely nothing. And they didn't. I had no idea I didn't know who they were referring to. I didn't know anything about Jesus. It meant nothing to me. And so I was invited to another meeting on campus, and it was about 100 students that were at this meeting, and there was an informal part of this meeting where some students were just informally, one would stand up and share something about the Lord, and I don't remember exactly what was said, but in the midst of that, as people would stand up and share some things, I tell people, the way I describe it is, I had an Apostle Paul experience, is what happened. Is that all of a sudden, it was in the midst of that, all of a sudden, I knew that Jesus was the Messiah. I never prayed a prayer of salvation, but I want to assure you that I will be in heaven with you. I never prayed a prayer of salvation, but I felt this all of a sudden. It was like the veil was lifted, and I understood. And I felt compelled that I needed to tell people what had just taken place. You recognize that from Scripture? You believe in your heart and confess with your mouth. And so I stood up and I said that I had trusted Jesus as my Messiah. The room was silent. I sat down. My palms were sweating, and I was wondering, what have I just done? And I thought I could identify later on. It was a book that was written. It was called "What's a Nice Jewish Boy Like You Doing in the First Baptist Church?" And so I guess I have to say Wesleyan Church here. But anyway, that was on March 3rd, 1970. It's interesting what was taking place during the late 60s and early 70s on college campuses across the country is that there were hundreds of Jewish kids just like me being swept into the kingdom. Back at that time, one of the things that everybody was talking about, no matter where you went to, whether it was in church, whether it was on a college campus, people were talking about the doctrine of future things, about the return of Christ, but other types of prophecy in the Scriptures. And there's a book that everybody was reading, and it was called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. And so I was now it wasn't those things that brought me to Christ, but it was in that era we were seeing God do an incredible work on college campuses that I have never seen duplicated since that time. This was during the Jesus movement, which was a real movement of God. And I really believe that in church history, it will be written up as one of the great awakenings that took place because of what took place there. And so I came to Christ in the midst of that. And so I began to grow in my faith. And one of the men that had shared Christ with me, he would meet with me and began to follow me up and help me grow in my faith. Well, the time came, and that was where I was going to learn to share my faith. And so I was fortunate to grow up within a ministry on our campus with a Great Commission mentality. I know nothing else beside a Great Commission mentality because that's how I grew up, about that people need to hear Jesus all over the world. And we need to be a part of His Great Commission. And so I needed to start learning how to share my faith. And so we went out to Old Main Lawn at Penn State, and we sat down next to a student randomly and began to talk with the student about spiritual things. I barely remember anything about this conversation except a couple of things. Number one, he claimed to be I can't remember whether it was an agnostic or an atheist, don't really remember that. But my reaction to this was, I never want to do this again. And that was 47 years ago, whatever it was. That was the beginning of me learning to share my faith. And then over time, as I began to learn to share my faith, it became something that was something that just drove me. At Penn State, one of the things we did is that we developed a strategy to reach the students for Christ. And so in my dorm, the goal was to reach every student in that dorm for Jesus. And so as I grew in my faith, I began to learn how to lead others to Christ, how to help them grow in their faith. But in that first couple of months after I became a believer, the time came where I knew that it was now time for me to go and tell my Jewish parents about this decision that I had made. In some Jewish homes, you will find that the parents will have a funeral for the child who embraces Jesus. Now, that didn't happen in my home, but my father said to me, he said, "I'll never attend your wedding." Now, I wasn't dating anybody, but he wanted to let me know what would happen in the future. I am really big on sending kids to college because of incredible experiences they can have there spiritually. And God did an incredible work in my life, and I was just like one of many other students that had God, from that time period, that God called to serve Him. And so I made the decision to join the staff. We were formerly called Campus Crusade for Christ, but to join Cru. It was now time to have another conversation with my parents, and that was about what I was going to be doing with my life. So I want you to imagine I was of the three children. My brother is older, the younger sister, but I was going to be the first professional in the family growing up in a blue-collar home. And so I'm going home to tell my parents that I'm joining the staff of this organization called Campus Crusade for Christ. And so you can imagine their response, and probably what you can imagine would be similar to how they responded. My mother went out of the room crying. My father they were very, very upset about this, and you could even might even think that they were thinking all the time and money that they had invested, and here I was throwing it away to join this organization. I know that my parents thought that I was joining a cult, and so I went off to Boston. That's where they ended up assigning me. And you know where I spent most of my time that year? It was Boston College, a Catholic school. And it was God's humor, because he wanted to teach me more about sharing my faith. And we were on a metro team, and so on some other campuses. It was, and so the next few years were real important years as I began to grow and learn how to build a ministry of reaching students. It was during this time that Colleen and I decided to get married, and I now had to have a third conversation with my parents. The first was becoming a believer. The second was coming on staff with this organization, Campus Crusade for Christ. And now I had the joy of this third conversation. I was going to be marrying a Gentile. And so I think my mother cried again. I'm not quite sure, but that was a very difficult conversation for them. Is when I talked with them about marrying Colleen. They didn't say no or anything like that. And one of the things that God did, which I wanted my non-believing parents to see, is that when I joined this organization, and when Colleen and I got married, I wanted them to see that we were normal. I realized that there are some things that are abnormal about us when we come to know Jesus. Hopefully, there are things that people want and admire and respect and want to engage in a conversation about the gospel. But I wanted my parents to see that we were normal, that this wasn't this cult, that it was something that a work that God was doing. And so over time, my parents did see that. Now, my parents never did come to know the Lord, but I think that one of the things that was so rewarding was seeing the relationship that formed between Colleen, a Gentile in the family, and my mother. Because she was the one that showed a lot of respect for my mother, and my mother never forgot that, how Colleen honored those conversations. And so our daughter Heather was born, and I love the idea of our staff, because our children are involved with our ministry. They get to see all sorts of things from the ground up, and so Heather just loved being involved with our ministry. And God had a different plan for her. But before I tell you that, one other thing that happened is that at 2.5 years old, we were in the car, and Heather prayed to receive Christ with us. You might think, well, 2.5 years old, I mean, a lot of questions, and rightly so. But she would always look back at that time of what happened in her life when she trusted Jesus as her Savior. It was one of the greatest. To this day, I would consider that the greatest accomplishment of my life, of seeing my daughter come to know Jesus. God had a different plan for her. As Heather grew in the Lord, and she was in her senior year in high school, and as she was driving to school, at about 1.5 miles from where we lived, Heather was killed in a car accident. You know, it's easy to quote that verse, all things work together for good, isn't it? How many here have quoted that verse and have used that? And you know, that verse is easy to quote, but it is hard to live out. It is easy to quote it about somebody else, but it's hard to live it out personally. But people forget there's another part, the next part of that verse, that all things work together for good to those who love him are called according to his purpose. And if you continue to reading, there's a purpose for that. That's to conform us to the image of his son, Jesus. That's the part that people don't quote, but goes hand in hand with that. And the way that God chooses to shape you and change you may not be the way that you want it to be. God will lead us in ways, in places that we choose not to go when we follow him. And so Heather was our only child. We never had any other children. And it took me 7 years before I could believe that I could believe in my head But if you were to ask me, do you believe that God loves you? It took me 7 years before I could emotionally connect with that again. It took me 7 years before I would be praying, and that I wouldn't quit saying, what's the use? Why do this? There was a pastor I had met whose son was killed, and he told me that what was so difficult for him on Sunday was preaching about this God who took his son. And I understand that. But over a period of time, I watched God begin to clear the fog in my life. You know, remember those things you used to look at when you were a kid, those kaleidoscope things, and you turn them and get, you know. And so the way I looked at it is that as I was looking through that kaleidoscope, and it just didn't come together, but over a period of time, it finally came together over a period of time. People grieve differently. Some take longer, and there's this misnomer that you get over it. Anybody who says you get over it hasn't met reality. You don't get over grief. When you love somebody, you don't get over it. And so will I ever get over Heather's death? The answer is no, I can't, because she was a part of me, and it's something that totally changed our lives as a result of what God did. You might want to say, well, that was something that Satan did. No, Satan didn't do that. God, my Father, took my daughter. He's the one that did that. The question is that am I willing to trust him knowing that? And then eventually I said yes, because I will. And so it took a while, but I learned that over time that the question was not why, because I think that's a perfectly normal question for people to cry out when they're in such grief and pain, as far as why, God, did you do this? I learned that wasn't the question. I learned what the question was not me asking God that question, but him asking me, am I willing to trust him with something that I don't understand, something that hurts this much? And so I had to come to the point of saying, yes, I will trust you. And so today, it is now over 23 years since Heather died, so today I can say that yes, I trust him, and all things do work together for good, because there's things that God did in my life that I know would not have changed without going through this. The question is, am I saying that God took Heather so that my life would change this way? No, that's not my theology. I will never know on this side of heaven why God took Heather. And frankly, it doesn't matter, the answer to that question. I know it's a question that we want answered deep in our heart. God, why'd you do this? But it's not the important question. Am I willing to trust you? Am I willing to walk by faith even though I don't understand all that's taken place? God has revealed enough about himself that I can say, yes, I can trust you. I don't understand what you've done here. If you were to ask me, Ellis, have you given thanks that God took your daughter? No, I don't give thanks that God took Heather. But what I am thankful for is that she knows more about Jesus than I do. You know, when I realized that was really humbling, realizing that Heather knows more about the Lord than I do. And I am grateful for that. I am grateful that she is with him. And I am not grateful that we haven't had all these years to be with her. Heather would have been 41 years old, and I would love to have seen the family that she would have had. But that wasn't God's plan for us. And as I get older, that becomes more painful. It's painful not to have grandchildren. You know, I hear people say, and talk about their grandchildren, saying, you know, how much, you know, and their children, you know, about how much meaning and fullness it gives their lives. And my response is, well, good for you. You know, that's what I want to say, because we can't experience that. But I want to assure you that's not what I mean. Is that I really want you to enjoy that. God just chose a different path for us. But God taught me some things through that, and has continued to do that has reshaped my life and how I go about ministry. It's changed that. As I said before, that I started out within our campus ministry. I directed our ministry at Brown University, one of the Ivy League schools. It was one of the toughest ministries I've ever had, was being at that school. And then over 30 years ago, I was asked to take on a position where part of that was helping our missionaries raise the funds, learn how to raise the funds for their ministries. And what ended up happening is that became really my calling and passion of what I do. I love helping missionaries learn to tackle something which so many fear about doing, and that's raising funds so they can be involved in the Great Commission. There are thousands of missionaries, thousands of people who have said no to missions because they are afraid of raising funds, of going through that process. There are people who've made that more difficult in reaching China for Jesus. That there are some missionaries that would rather crawl over glass than raise funds. Now, I realize that doesn't make any sense, but yet that's the fear factor that's there. And I have an incredible privilege to train our staff members, and over the years I've trained over 14,000 missionaries how to raise their funds so that they can fulfill what God has called them to do. And I just love doing that. Now, I don't know what your caricature that you might have of Jewish people, but I just think it's kind of comical that God has a Jewish guy in Campus Crusade for Christ training people how to raise money. But only I can say that, because if you said it, I would say it's anti-Semitic. But anyway, I love what I do. I've been doing that for decades and will continue to do that.